Thank you very much, Sir Henry. Oceans cover around 71% of the Earth's surface and around 90% of the Earth's biosphere. They contain around 250,000 different known species, and likely vastly more than that, given that so little of our oceans have been properly explored or understood. I want to speak today about the tragedy of what is happening to our oceans and about what we need to do to protect them. There was a time when our oceans were absolutely brimming with life. In 1497, the explorer John Cabot complained how his ship's progress had been hampered by the sheer volume of cod off the coast of Newfoundland. He wrote a message to his sponsor, King Henry VII, and he said his men, quote, took so many fish that his kingdom will no longer have need of Iceland, from which country there is an immense trade in the fish. As we now know, industrial fishing very quickly put an end to that. In 1968, the registered catch was 800,000 tons. By 1994, the catch was just 1,700 tons. In Victorian England, you could have seen large pods of orcas and blue whales off the coast of Cornwall. Professor Callum Roberts has reminded us that in 1836, a shoal of sardines extended in a single compact body from Fowey to the Land's End, a distance of around 100 miles. He notes that today people pay very serious money to travel thousands of miles to witness such scenes. Today we face an unprecedented loss of species in our oceans, comparable to the mass extinctions of past millennia. The Zoological Society of London and WWF issued a report a year ago telling us that there is only half the amount of wildlife in the sea today as there was in 1970, just a few years before I was born. Between 70 and 80% of the world's marine fish stocks have either been fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted, or are recovering from depletion. Of the 17 large fisheries in the world, 15 are now so heavily depleted that future catches can no longer be guaranteed. A scientific paper in Nature reports that we've lost 90% of the world's big predatory fish, like tunas and sharks. Only 5% of coral reefs are considered pristine. And despite serving as breeding grounds for 85% of commercial fish, a third of the world's mangroves have been destroyed since 1990. This annihilation is happening right across the world, and it is an unforgivable biodiversity tragedy, but it is also a human tragedy. Around 200 million people depend directly on the fishing industry for their livelihoods. For more than 1 billion people, fish is their primary source of protein. If the fishing industry collapses, the effects are obviously disastrous, especially for the world's poorest people. And you only have to look at what happened in Somalia a couple of decades ago. Years of overfishing, mostly by vast foreign fleets, decimated the coastal economy when fish stocks ran out. Legal fishing gave way to piracy, and millions were plunged into poverty, with criminality taking over. There are numerous causes of this loss, and there are numerous things that we need to do to put things right. But the biggest and the focus of this debate is simply protection. Marine protected areas represent a broad spectrum, everything from absolute no-take zones to areas only open to sustainable fishing. And the thing is, we know they work. We know that because you can literally measure the results of protection. When commercial fishing had to stop in the Atlantic and North Sea because of World War II, there was an immediate spike in fish populations. In New Zealand's Lee Marine Reserve, common predatory fish are now 6 times more abundant in the reserve than outside the reserve. In the same country's Tarawhanua, apologies for the pronunciation, marine reserve, there are 60% more species in the reserve than out. Spain suffered massively from overfishing, but catches close to the Tabarca Marine Reserve were 85% higher after just 6 years of protection than elsewhere. And so on and on and on, all around the world. There is a level of agreement, I think, about the scale of the problem, but the response, an international commitment to protect 10% of the world's oceans by 2020, is far below what is needed. And to make matters much worse, we're nowhere near even achieving that. The British government does get it. We've committed to pushing for the protection of 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. And despite being a relatively small nation, we're in a good position to take the lead. We are, after all, custodians of the 5th largest marine estate in the world, thanks to our extensive overseas territories. Territories, incidentally, that contain over 94% of the UK's unique biodiversity. They're scattered across the world and are home to countless rare and threatened species. Breeding grounds... Yes, please.
With In the context of our overseas territories, Blue Belt is an incredibly ambitious policy. Would my honourable friend agree that we will only be judged on its success in terms of how we support different marine protections around different archipelagos and islands? And would you agree with me that Ascension Island is an absolute key one that people are looking at to see whether the government are willing the means in order to make sure that the marine protection area is a success, and then thereby have confidence in what we will be doing globally?
I thank him very much for that intervention, and I agree with him 100%. And I do want to put on the record my thanks to him and to our colleague, the Honourable Member, the Right Honourable Member for Dorset West, Dorset West, not Dorset East, who really have led this campaign in Parliament, and I think can take a lot of credit for the government's current position. And my right honourable friend here is about to intervene on me in relation to one of the... not yet, I think. I'm going to ask him to hold for just 1 second, because I know what he's going to ask me. The overseas territories are enormously important. They're breeding grounds for endangered turtles, a third of the world's albatrosses, a quarter of the world's penguins, the world's largest coral atoll. In what remains, I think, to this day, the biggest conservation commitment ever made by any government ever, our government pledged to protect over 4 million square kilometres across those overseas territories by 2020. It's an area, if you put it all together, bigger than India. And I think that commitment makes us world leaders in ocean protection. It's hard to think, in fact, of a better illustration of global Britain. But, yes, please.
Just remind the House of my entry in the register members' interest that last year I visited South Georgia at the expense of the Commissioner of South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands. Will my honourable friend welcome this morning's announcement by the government that, partly as a result of his pressure, they are to extend the no-take boundaries around South Georgia from 12 miles to 31 miles, that they're going to extend the MPA around the whole of the South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands maritime zone, which means 173,000 square kilometres will now be protected entirely from commercial fishing, and the intent to designate the South Sandwich Islands trench region, the most important bit. The trench region is going to be closed to all commercial fisheries. I hope my honourable friend will welcome that announcement.
I thank him for his intervention, and yes, of course, I hugely welcome the announcement. And I'll be coming to that in just a few moments. I'm going to canter through some of the overseas territories and some of the work that we're doing and some of the work that we need to be doing. I would just simply say that the move that we've heard about today, that the Honourable Member has just referenced, I think does actually put to rest a lot of the arguments against full protection. But I will come to that, and no doubt we'll have an argument in due course. The commitment that I've described is a great commitment, and one that we can be proud of. But alone, clearly, it's not enough. We need to make good on it properly, and we need to go further. And before I go into the details of the Blue Belt, I'm hoping the Minister can confirm when he stands to speak that funding for the Blue Belt will be assured beyond 2020. It's £4.8 million a year. And I think in terms of what we get from it, it is spectacularly good value for money. But I want to look more broadly at the actual Blue Belt commitments. In some areas where we've made promises, we have spectacularly delivered. The Pitcairn Islands, for example, in the Pacific, they are surrounded by the most pristine marine environment anywhere on Earth, and it is just magnificent that the government has permanently closed those waters, covering around 840,000 square kilometres to commercial fishing. It's one of the largest protected areas in the world. Tristan da Cunha, a tiny island in the South Atlantic, has waters with vast populations of seals, southern right whales, blue sharks, as well as being home to great numbers of seabirds and rockhopper penguins. The government has committed to protecting the full 750,000 square kilometres of Tristan's waters by 2020. I'm hoping the Minister can confirm when he speaks that we will make good on that commitment and that we'll help the tiny local population by protecting the area from illegal fishing. In 2016, the government committed to a marine protected area of 450,000 square kilometres around St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. It's an area bigger than Germany and has over 40 endemic species, including whale sharks, turtles, and humpback whales. The aspiration is to develop a sustainable one-by-one, that's one hook to catch one fish at a time, tuna fishery in its own marine protected area. But at this stage, St. Helena is yet to ban industrial longlining from its waters, and the government clearly needs to work with the local population to put that right as a matter of urgency. Ascension Island, that my honourable friend mentioned earlier in the Atlantic Ocean, has 450,000 square kilometres of ocean, and the second largest green turtle breeding population in the Atlantic. It is a hotspot for sharks, tuna, and swordfish. The government is currently committed to protecting at least 50% of the area by 2019, but there is nothing stopping the government going further and protecting the whole area. And I understand that the Islands Council itself is minded to back 100% of protection, but they're looking for assurances from the government that they won't then be saddled with the costs of satellite monitoring for effective enforcement. They calculate, incidentally, that it would be cheaper to protect the whole area rather than half, so it shouldn't be a barrier, and I hope the Minister will address that point when he speaks. Finally, viewers of the extraordinary Blue Planet 2 series will know that the greatest gift the government can provide the oceans lies further south in South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. My honourable friend has just referenced. This is why the title of this debate specifically mentions that area. These tiny, uninhabited islands are near pristine global biodiversity hotspot. A full quarter of the global population of penguins live there, alongside recovering populations of whales, seals, unique marine habitats. The local government designated the whole 1 million square kilometres around the islands as an MPA in 2012. But while the fisheries around South Georgia are managed to a high standard, undoubtedly, until this morning, just 2% of the total waters were fully protected. I understand, we've seen news today that that area has been increased from 2% to 23%, and that is fantastic news. However, the remaining 77% is still technically open to fishing, and this can easily change. There is a huge groundswell of opinion among scientists, NGOs, and colleagues in this House behind the campaign to fully protect the waters around South Sandwich Islands in particular. That's around 500,000 square kilometres, roughly half of the whole MPA. Yes, I agree.
On securing this important debate. The designation of those waters is an important step, but does he agree with me that we shouldn't confuse designation with protection, and that we should encourage the government to be bolder in protecting more of our fragile ocean environment, especially those that the UK has an involvement with?
Yeah, I very much take this one. In fact, he takes the words out of my mouth. The remaining half, in other words, not the 500,000 square kilometres that do need full protection, would still be open to well-managed fisheries. And colleagues will have seen the case powerfully made, I think, by the Broad Coalition in an open letter to the Foreign Secretary, which was published, I think, in the Telegraph last week and went wild on social media. This is a genuine win-win proposal. The South Sandwich Islands have not been commercially fished in 25 years, so no fishing at all would be displaced. Upgrading the existing MPA to give it full protection it can be achieved within existing budgets and within existing legislation. Politically, it would demonstrate the UK's willingness to lead by example, and on that point I give way.
Very good, well, most generous. Nonetheless, the point he makes is there has been no commercial fishing in this area for 25 years. There's no prospect that there will be in the next 25 years either, and therefore what he's proposing, or what he's been campaigning for, is tokenistic in the extreme. Will he not simply take this opportunity of welcoming the fact that the government have now protected the krill fisheries by an extra 2 months, by the fact they're banning HFO for vessels from the area, and taking a variety of other environmental steps to protect this area in the way that he wants, and merely calling for more and more protection in a tokenistic and campaigning sort of way achieves nothing apart from alienation of local people.
I thank him for giving way. I mean, I think to suggest that we shouldn't protect an area because it hasn't yet been destroyed is madness. The same argument could be used equally, or could have been used equally, to pretty much any one of the world's great nature reserves, including the national parks that are a source of pride in this country. I think the fact that it hasn't been exploited, the fact that an industry hasn't yet been able to develop there is precisely why it needs protection. If a fishing industry were to emerge and develop in that area, the prospect of then removing it would be inconceivable. It would be vastly expensive, hugely disruptive, very politically difficult, and it just wouldn't happen. So it's because it hasn't been fished, it's because it is currently pretty much pristine that it requires the kind of protection that the campaigners are rightly asking for. As I said, politically, I think this move would demonstrate the UK's willingness to lead by example, but I'd go further than that. If we're not willing to protect this pristine, unfished, global biodiversity gem, how could anyone take seriously our commitment to supporting 30% of the world's oceans being protected? I don't think you could achieve one without also committing to the other. And despite great leadership on this issue, the Foreign Office does seem to have hit the buffers somewhat, and those involved on the inside and on the outside are frankly scratching their heads. So whatever the block, I do strongly urge ministers to be decisive, to be bold, and to just get on with it.